Hello and welcome to Traveling Lighter. This month, I'm very happy to introduce you to Mike Kewley, who I came to through the book The Treasure House, published by New Sarum Press. That's Catherine Noyce and Julian Noyce's publishing house. We met Catherine a few months ago, and I absolutely loved the book. Um, it's about Mike's journey into non-duality, and Mike teaches mindfulness in the Isle of Man through or with non-duality, which makes it very similar to the Course Coming to Our Senses. There's not many people who use these two words, I would say, although they're, like I mentioned, talked to you, Mike, before this, they seem to be intertwined implicitly and tacitly, but not many people speak out about it. I know Loch Kelly does, and you definitely do. So I'm fascinated to hear about your story and about how you teach mindfulness. So thanks so much for joining us, um, and welcome.
Thank you. Thanks so much for the introduction as well. Um, so I don't know where to start really. I'll try and keep it short and snappy. I mean, I could start with mindfulness and my journey to mindfulness, or I could start with my journey into non-duality, and both will end up in the other's house, if you like. But just to give you a brief overview, um, and of course, if you speak to someone just about non-duality, they might say, well, there's nothing to say, because there's no one here, there's no story, it's all just a puff of smoke, which is true, but I'll give you my story anyway. So I was brought up here on the Isle of Man, and my dad was a lay Buddhist in the Theravada tradition, and he used to run the Isle of Man Buddhist group. So I grew up surrounded by people meditating. Western Buddhists, basically. And occasionally, my father's teachers, who were quite renowned Burmese monks, would come to the island um, and teach. And we would take them to various places on the island. And I didn't really know who they were or what meditation was, but that was the atmosphere I grew up in. Buddhism. And then my dad became a monk for a few months as well when I was a bit older. So he went to stay in a monastery, which was in Birmingham, so it wasn't too far. But he still became an ordained monk there. So that was what I grew up around, Buddhism and the teachings of the Buddha. But it wasn't until I was maybe 17, 16, 17, when I was really having a hard time, as a teenager, having a hard time with my mental health, that I began to explore meditation seriously, as in something that would help me overcome my depression and anxiety. I was in a job that I loathed. I was in a strange situation where I had the mortgage to our family home to pay as well. So there was a lot of stress on me at that age. And so I called up my dad one day. He was living in Israel at the time, teaching mindfulness in Israel. And I just kind of told him everything that was wrong with my life. And he just said, okay, I want you to sit down. And he basically taught me how to meditate over the phone. Um, which was great. And I instantly began to act on that because I'd already been to the doctor and he'd said, well, I can put you onto medication. Um, but that something about that didn't seem to be the direction to go for me because I knew that all of the noise in my head was right here, right inside here, and all the tension in my body and the panic was right here, the knot in my stomach. Well, I could put my hand on that as well. So I knew that all of that stuff lived inside me. It was mine. It was me. So surely there was something I could do to transform it or at least relate to it differently. And there was no pill required for that. There was just a change in perspective. Um, I was lucky perhaps in that I did have that background in Buddhism, and even if I didn't really know what people were doing, obviously there was some residue of understanding that helped me to go down that path. So I started a simple 10-minute mindfulness practice every day, sitting quietly on a cushion, watching my breath. Within 6 weeks, it was like I was living in a brand new world with a brand new mind. It was magical. And I've basically continued to practice ever since. 45 now, so that's quite a time. Um, but the next kind of jump in my story comes when I'm 29, and I realize that I was using my practice, as many people do, to do a lot of bypassing, which is very easy to do, especially when you don't have a teacher. So I didn't really have a fixed teacher. I traveled a lot in India and well, a lot in India, but also Nepal, Thailand, Burma, Pakistan. I was always drawn to certain gurus, some in the UK as well, some non-dual teachers in the UK. Because really I wasn't practicing to be calm, the sort of modern secular mindfulness idea. Just be calm, do some mindfulness. Don't have so many sick days at work. You'd be more productive. Just be calm. That wasn't why I was practicing. I was practicing because I grew up with the model from my dad, implicitly, that the purpose of human life is to become awakened. That's why my dad was practicing. And so when I saw my dad doing that as a little boy, I realized, oh, that's the point. It's not to become a famous explorer or general or a mountain climber, whatever. It's to become enlightened. And I remember thinking around 7 or 8, well, that's what I have to do then. Now, obviously, I had no idea of how you do that or even what the word enlightenment meant. Um, but I thought, well, that's the point. So that was the underlying driving force, really, through my teenage years and my travels, meeting enlightened teachers and gurus, having moments of satori, some of which were liberating, most of which were absolutely terrifying, because there were moments of sheer disorientation where the mic character would suddenly fall away. And I didn't know who I was in those moments. And it was frightening. And then the sort of mic program would kick back in, thankfully. Um, so that happened quite a lot of that sort of flip-flopping. And it didn't really seem to have much to do with my practice. My practice was, sort of open awareness a lot of the time, just sitting with this experience, watching it happen. That was kind of, I wasn't going into jhanas or anything like that. I wasn't that advanced in certain meditations. But my intention was always clear. I wanted to wake up. And so, with hindsight, it seems that it was the intention that was doing a lot of the work rather than whatever practice I happened to be doing. And then I would meet teachers who would just wash away all my questions and point back at me and say, it's you. It's you right now. Which, of course, is more confusing because you think, oh, I'm just a screwed up ball of anxiety. How can it be me? But they weren't talking about me, the personality, the thinking mind. They were pointing back, to my true nature, my essence, my beingness, whatever word we want to use. And after some time, that sort of began to make sense. The fact that they weren't giving me something to practice at first was confusing. Okay, you're telling me I am pure consciousness. I am life itself. So how do I practice that? Well, of course you don't. What practice could you do, that would either take you away from what you are or lead you to what you are? You are what you are, aren't you? So after a while, that began to sink in more and more and more, and the sort of driving, seeking mentality, I must practice to become enlightened, just began to get weaker and weaker and weaker. And then when I was 29, I sort of hit a dead end. Um, a lot of the stuff that I've been bypassing through my practice was really bubbling up and needed to come out in a different way. Um, and of course, now obviously teaching people, sometimes it's beneficial for people to do mindfulness practice. Sometimes it's beneficial for them to move deeper into their into the question of who and what they are. Sometimes it's just best to send them to a counselor or a therapist. And often the two really work well together, especially if it's something like trauma, you know, um, because you can get very good at bypassing with mindfulness. You know, you just drop into that no mind state, no mind, no problem. But it doesn't mean you're actually dealing with any of the issues that are in there. They're just sort of hidden for the moment. So mine was sort of really bubbling up. And so I did what felt like a real backstep at the time, which was I decided to go and see a counselor because I was getting so depressed and dejected about not becoming awakened yet. You know, I could write down what the awakened state was on paper. I knew it intellectually. I'd done 2 degrees on, well, on enlightenment. I wrote an essay, I wrote a thesis on enlightenment, which is the most un-Zen thing you can do, which is write an essay on it. And nothing. And also, I was deeply immersed in the teachings of anatta or no self, especially from non-dual teachers like Tony Parsons, where there's no real teaching or practice other than there's no self, there's no one here, there's no one to do anything. And at first, that was quite liberating for me and led to these moments of no self. But after a while, I found myself really stuck because I thought, okay, I'm now getting really depressed because I'm not enlightened. But my understanding is there's no body here, so there's nothing to do, which means I'm now just stuck. You know, if I start practicing, I'm fueling the ego. But if I do nothing, I sink deeper into depression. I'm in trouble now. So I decided to see a counselor at the time, which was the right move. And in fact, one spiritual teacher once said to me, well, he said to a group of people that I was in, until you become awakened, therapy is the most intelligent thing you can do. Uh, and he was quite hardcore non-dual as well, so it was quite nice for him to say that because I think he gave a lot of people another avenue to explore. And so that sort of led me towards therapy. The therapy helped enormously and really quickly because I was so ready just to get out my, you know, stuckness. So I didn't hesitate. I didn't have to build up a rapport. I was just session one, blah, out it came. And feeling better very quickly. And it was just talk therapy. And then I got to the stage after a few months where I thought, oh, do you know what? I don't need to become awake anymore. I don't need to become enlightened anymore. That project has or is rapidly fading, which I never thought would happen because I hadn't really planned beyond it. In my mind, I was going to live like Eckhart Tolle and I was going to sleep on park benches in glens and, you know, just walk barefoot here and there, having become awakened.
Mm.
So I didn't really have much of a plan. And then I realized I don't need that anymore. Maybe I'll teach, you know, maybe I'll become a travel writer. Maybe I'll just try and do writing. Maybe I'll just travel more. Maybe I'll, you know, do art or, you know, maybe I'll just do something more normal and human. And which was, that's a brand new way of thinking for me. And then one day I was in the library at university because I was just finishing off a master's degree. And I picked up a book on the shelf that I've been meaning to read on Enlightenment by Rupert Spira. And I thought, I'll just flick through this before my counseling session. Um, I'll just have a look. It's probably the last book on spirituality I'll read because it's only given me trouble. And so I started reading quite nonchalantly. Usually I would pore over these books, I would scribble in the margins, I would type out quotations and put them on my wall. I just had a flick through, and then, I don't know, 3 pages in, I read a sentence, the whole world stopped. And I had a non-dual awakening that lasted about an hour, in which it became absolutely clear immediately that there was never someone in here called Mike that needed to get enlightened or become fixed or healed, and that what there is just an impersonal, all-embracing awareness or reality that is everything, including this Mike character, including the songs of the birds or the cloud or the feeling in your fingers or the taste of coffee or your neighbor's cat or the car fumes. It's all of that. It's everything. It's the ocean arising as the waves. Um, so, so that was good because that basically something snapped. Let's put it that way. Something snapped and it didn't, it hasn't come back. And what snapped was this sort of identification with being, this cluster of thoughts and feelings. Um, and just to go forward, uh, I came back to the Isle of Man a few years later and and met my wife, and she suggested I teach mindfulness, which I'd been doing my whole life anyway. And I didn't really want to go back to teaching mindfulness because the non-dual awakening kind of blew mindfulness practice as we know it out of the water. You know, why would you sit down and get somebody to start tracking their breath when you can tell them that they are the cosmos, you know? And but I did, and I tried to break it down, you know, to bring it right back to sort of step one. You know, what's going to help someone who is consumed and wholly identified with their mind as what they are? What's going to help them even just settle that a little bit? And so I began to run some workshops, but I sort of couldn't help almost accidentally emphasizing the non-dual perspective. And so one of the first workshops, which was full of people, including a teacher who had just retired that day or the day before, and she'd come to this workshop to calm down. And I said something like, without really planning it, I said something like, God is the only thing in this room right now. And someone said, if you say that word again, I'm leaving. And, you know, she had a point. And so afterwards, I had to reflect and think, okay, Mike, I can't just go jumping in with these kinds of things. So what I've done basically over the last 10 years, a bit more than that, is I've had to sort of teach mindfulness backwards from a non-dual perspective. And, you know, and in that process, rediscover and reignite my passion for what are sometimes known as foundational practices or even basic practices like breath awareness, you know. Well, the breath is the only thing giving you life. Breath is spirit, literally spiritus. So going back into breath, back into sensation, into an exploration of what are thoughts, what are sensations, what is this self that we keep referring to. Um, so for me now, when I teach mindfulness, it's a way into that deep end. And I tend to tell people from the start that certainly in the way I practice it, it's not about having no thoughts. It's not about being calm. It's not about, you know, feeling anything. It's just about being absolutely present with whatever is here in this moment. And really, when you dip into that fully, that is the non-dual experience. Only we don't often recognize. If you recognized it, that would be an awakening. Oh, I realized there was just this expansive reality and it was all things. And sometimes people do say that. Even people that come to like a drop-in session. We do a guided practice and they'll say there was no me. Everything was just is. Everything just was. It was peace. Um, which is lovely. Um, but it just doesn't last. And there was no sort of sustaining recognition that, oh, now I realize I'm not that. I'm not what I thought I was. But even the very basic practices can be an opening for people. But I also love structure, um, because I'm sort of self-diagnosed ADHD as well. So, eh, which means that if I don't have structure, I can go all over the place. So I really like structure as well because it keeps me on track. And I think it helps people in a more step-by-step process to uncover their core freedom. So I'm going to be quiet now. I
Oh,
don't know if that was useful.
I've been criticized for using this word too much in these podcast videos, which is that was beautiful,
Thank you.
which isn't supposed to matter in the non-dual world, but it's just beautiful, and it's so lovely to hear that perspective. It's such a valuable perspective. I can hazard a guess at which non-duality teacher said that if you're not awake in therapy is I won't I won't say, but I can guess. Therapy is probably the most useful thing you can do if you're not awakened. But I think probably many people find themselves in exactly that situation of not knowing how to go forward or backwards or just being stuck in the middle.
Hmm.
Um, I'm curious about, so my background is theatre and applied theatre, and then I was working with a method called sensory labyrinth theatre, which was an immersive method I developed, and the audience was giving very profound feedback. So I thought I should go back to university and study mindfulness to make sure I wasn't doing any harm. So since then, I've been teaching mindfulness conventional curricula. And then a few years ago, I thought, well, why don't I bring the applied theatre and the mindfulness together? And that's all tinged with the influence of non-duality, which is comes from just glimpsing our true nature through this work. And this is what this course, Coming to Our Senses, does. So it's a very structured course with these creative challenges couched by meditations. But it does try and follow the 8 week pattern set up by John Kabat-Zinn with MBSR, not strictly, but has elements of the learning objectives within that course in it. So I'm really curious if you follow a conventional curriculum or you've just thrown that off the table and created your own, or how does that work?
Yeah, it's not conventional really, and it's more traditional than than anything. And I guess my main teacher, although not a formal teacher, was my dad. And he still teaches. Well, he doesn't teach Buddhism because, as he says, the Buddha wasn't a Buddhist, Christ wasn't a Christian, but they
Mm,
were just sharing from the heart. And that's the transmission. It's that heart to heart, human to human, direct sharing.
mm,
So he still does that. But it's the Dharma. He teaches the Dharma. So I grew up with the Dharma, and he was my informal teacher, if you like. You know, many hours of long questioning. Dad, what's the self? Dad, why do they say there's no self? Dad, what's anatta? Dad, what does impermanence mean? And he'd be like, oh God, Mike, you asked too many questions, which was true. So because he was from this traditional background, and he knew a lot of he's of that generation where he knew a lot of the American teachers that basically brought mindfulness back to back to America.
mm,
Um, but yeah, so I mean, he wasn't critical of the more secular models, but he preferred the more traditional model. So that was kind of the way I went as well.
mm,
What I teach now, I teach lots of things, but my 6 week mindfulness course is the sort of thing I teach most frequently. And I just say that it's based on six of the most profound practices and perspectives I've encountered so far,
mm,
you know, which are drawn from many, many different sources because there's many, many different traditions of mindfulness.
mm,
You go to Mahayana, and it's completely different. You're using your imagination, you're doing all this kind of stuff. You're, uh, looking back into your true nature, you're doing a lot of very interesting things. But if you go into Theravada, it's very much, you sit, don't move, there's your breath, just go as deeply into that as you can.
mm,
Or then you have Zen, which again, I mean, I grew up on Zen Buddhism and samurai stories and Zen koan, so I love the Zen approach as well because it's a nice, almost anti-intellectual approach to us in our academic culture. We're all taught to think and be thinkers. And Zen says, well, your thinking mind isn't going to get it,
mm,
you know. So no, it doesn't follow any sort of set secular curricula. And I'm the kind of person as well that I like to have the challenge of creating something new,
mm,
you know. Because then I can talk about it directly from my own experience. Um, yeah.
mm. And is this course um, something that you teach people to teach, that you train people to teach it, or is it something you're not ready to share with other teachers?
Um, no is the answer. I don't teach people to teach the course. I could, and maybe I should,
Mm,
um, but that's not something I've either got round to or had the course certified or in order to train people to do it.
mm,
Um, but I have a lot of long-term students that have been practicing for, a long time that probably could.
mm,
They probably know it off by heart, but no, no, there's no sort of teacher instruction
mm,
that I do.
mm. I'll just ask one more question, and then I'll open it up to Paul and Alice if they have any. And so somebody's coming to a 6 week course that you're teaching. Maybe they're just coming to be a little more calm. They really don't want to be introduced to the final taboo of there being no self and all the horrors that entails. How do you balance that in a group?
Yeah, yeah, good question. And, and I was just thinking as you were saying there, the horrors of no self are nothing compared to the horrors of self.
Yes, that's a good one. Yeah, it's true.
But yeah, I see what you mean. Well, yeah, I'll just briefly take you through the sort of basic content, and it's quite a dynamic course because one of the one of the main themes, I guess, of my understanding has been not knowing or unknowing.
Mm,
And so, when it's easy just to say, oh, this is this and that's that. And I find real joy and freedom in not knowing, not having to know, and sort of ultimately knowing that I can't know conceptually. Even whatever word you call it, life, consciousness, God, a cup of tea, they're just concepts.
mm,
There's just this mysterious event happening right now that has no name,
mm,
and we are it. So I always point that out that, and because of that, the course develops because, for me, the unknowing often reveals more and more insights or flavors. So I try and integrate them into the course every time I teach it. So it almost has a life of its own, which is maybe one of the reasons why sometimes I feel I couldn't teach this to someone because then it becomes a stuck course.
mm,
Here's the content.
mm,
Anyway, so the first week is just about being present, or rather, looking at all the reasons we're not present, living in the past, living in the future. And then just doing a simple breath awareness practice to sort of anchor ourselves in the breath, in the present moment, and just let the thinking mind settle. So calming the mind, turn the volume down on all of that chatter, um, calming the default mode network,
mm,
um, which just that alone, knowing how to calm down your mind is life-changing.
mm,
You don't need enlightenment, because that's for some people, that's it. That's enough. The second week we look at thoughts, which are, well, you know, 99.9999% of all our suffering happens here.
mm,
And it's concept based, it's thinking that generates it. So we look at how to step back, observe, and detach from thoughts in real time. And I use a labeling technique just so we can notice, oh yeah, that's a thought. It's not real, it's not true. I'm not psychic. I don't know what he's thinking. I don't know what she's thinking. I don't know what's going to happen in the next 10 seconds. It's just a thought. Um, and it's very simple. I mean, I teach this to kids, but because often we've never related to our thoughts in that way, we just automatically accept them. The ability to say, oh, hang on, that is just a thought. And if I just step back, it passes. That's the practice of freedom, you know? And then the third week, we move down into the body, which, really is where everything's happening from the neck down. And so my approach is once you can kind of quieten down the head, you could really get down into the body and see what's happening there.
mm,
And so well, the body scan is what we do really.
mm,
Um, so yeah, the value of calming your body physically, helping you sleep easier, but then also uh, exploring and soaking reactivity, emotions in awareness, silent awareness.
mm,
Almost like we just hold the feeling and just let it bubble, shift, pinch without any resistance.
mm,
And then usually what happens is people say, oh, it just melted.
mm,
Yes. Remember that. Yeah. And then we move on to the loving kindness practice.
mhm,
So, not just calming things down, but generating, uh, you know, love, kindness, generosity, open-heartedness, connection.
mm,
And then we look at impermanence or transience, that our sensory experience is transitory in real time.
mm,
Anything you start paying attention to is already popping,
mm,
which can be quite profound, both in terms of observing the fact that you are not a solid, stuck thing, but also, relating impermanence to our own existence and realizing that we are precious and fragile and fleeting.
mm,
And then, beginning to become more present because life is fleeting.
mm,
So that's what enforces everything we've looked at so far as a way to be more present and to really, really be here for each miraculous moment.
mm,
That's week 5. And then week 6 is how to bring that into daily life. So
mm,
we do an eyes open practice, which is Shinzen Young's see, hear, feel practice.
mm,
I don't know if you're aware of him, but he's worth Googling. So he's a contemporary mindfulness teacher in America, um, who's created his own system of mindfulness, uh, which I really like. And so his kind of basic technique is called see, hear, feel. But it's basically a way of walking around in daily life, eyes open, but everything we're noticing, seeing, feeling, we're mentally just labeling it as it happens.
mm,
So you go into a very focused flow state, really,
mm.
and it helps you stay very present. And it's a way of turning life into a meditation.
Yeah.
So that's kind of it. That's kind of what I teach.
Mm.
Um, yeah.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for that. Something that I noticed and compelled me to create the curriculum I teach now, coming to their senses, was that after 20 years of teaching the conventional practices and starting with focusing on the breath, less and less people can do it. People are deluged by thoughts and just feeling this is hopeless, this is not for me, I can't do it. And recognizing that this is very much to do with the invention of the mobile phone and that's rewired our brain. And it, and there's this and you mentioned sort of getting away from default mode network, but what I would say is that we don't have enough default mode network in the sense that there's no space in our day where we are self-referencing or mind wandering. We're constantly in task positive mode. So the moment we ask the person to sit still, the default mode network goes, well, hey,
Mhm.
and comes in. So in a way, we start with a different method called dropping the balloon, which is you don't have to be in the task positive mode network. Let your mind wander, but there's nothing to do here. Which I feel is necessary for people to give themselves permission just to be here.
Mhm.
Um, and it is after 20 years seeing this immediate reaction among people to just focusing on the breath and it being impossible, and that's my theory anyway.
Yeah, I encounter that a lot. Maybe not 50-50, but 40-60,
Mm,
which is why, we explore different in my course, I take through different practices because then you have a sort of range of skills, and sometimes it's when we get to the last practice that people will say, "Oh, that's what you mean by a quiet mind."
uh-huh,
It's like, yeah, so now you found it,
uh-huh,
run with that one. But yeah, breath awareness certainly is not for everyone. But
mm,
I like your approach there
mm,
because before you even get to beginning to sort of have a method or a practice, I agree that the most valuable thing we can offer really is a space just to sit,
mm,
where there's nothing to do. Let your mind wander.
mm,
Do nothing because we don't get that anywhere else in life, really.
mm,
Um, so yeah, that permission just to, as you say, drop the balloon, just
mm,
be.
mm.
Mm.
Thanks. I'm gonna try and bring um, Alice and Paul in, who've been writing notes furiously. No, they haven't. They're teachers. They don't write notes.
I'm interested in, you say you've been working with children, you've worked with children as well. I was just wondering a bit about what you've done there and how you found that, as opposed to working with adults.
Yeah. Um, well, different in a number of ways, and different, and children with different reasons for coming to mindfulness. Generally, what I found is with younger children, with younger children, often parents will get in touch and say, "Oh, my child is 6, 7. They're all over the place. They're busy, they're frantic. Can you teach them mindfulness to calm down?" And at this point, I think no. I think no, no. They're 6, they're 7. Just let them be 6 or 7. Um, I think as parents, if we can embody mindfulness, presence, patience, calm, tolerance, I think that will echo in our children. So often I think the responsibility really for young children, it lies on the parents. So whenever I work with children, I really encourage the parents to attend and also learn because family is a feedback loop. You can't just say, right, you learn some mindfulness,
Mm.
Well, how about you do too? Um, so yeah, and with older children, teens, I always find it a bit easier. I always find that they're often a bit they sort of understand it conceptually a bit easier. Younger children, they don't really know why they're there. They haven't really got the differentiation yet between what's up with me being busy. It's older children, they're beginning to notice where it's a struggle or a problem. So I have worked with a lot of kids and teenagers with ADHD, whether that's self-diagnosed or diagnosed. Um, Sometimes it doesn't really seem to help. Other times they say it's completely changed everything. As I always say, it only works if you do it. And that's the main thing. It only works if you do it. And so if you're sat with someone, teaching them, they're doing it. The rest of the time, that's why for young children, it's a practice. It is a discipline. And without, I'm talking to teachers, but we don't like that word anymore, but it just means to learn, to practice, to sharpen up a skill so that you can use that skill. So this is the downside with mindfulness, Lots of people think, oh, I want my children to learn how to be present and calm, but I can show you the technique, but I can't come around your house and make sure you're doing it. You have to be motivated enough to do that yourself, really. Um, but then, yeah, so older children, and I've worked with a lot of sixth form aged kids, and that's a real joy because at that age, they really want to learn. And I've got a few students who have now in their 20s who first came to my sessions in sixth form. And, they were having driving lessons and A levels, but they were dropping into states of no mind in the guided meditation and realizing, wow, I'm not thinking in that period. I'm clear-headed, I'm calm, I'm tranquil, and that helps the rest of my day. So, yeah.
I'm a secondary school teacher, you see, so um, I can see a lot of need in secondary school children, and that's just really fascinating that you say that sixth form is a particular sector. I can imagine that to be the case.
And of course, it depends on how you're, sharing it and approaching it. I mean, there was one study recently on, a mindfulness in schools project, which sort of just, said the whole thing was an absolute waste of time, and the pupils got nothing from it. But actually, it was the teachers that benefited,
Yeah,
which you can understand. Um, but it depends, again, it depends on how you're teaching it. Because if you're coming in there, this is from my point of view, if you're coming in there with a structured program, okay, kids, you're already learning all this other structured curricula, and now we're going to show you another structured curricula. It becomes another thing to do. I don't want to do anything else. So my approach is a bit more maybe friendly and story-led. So I would just tell them stories from the samurai tradition or a traditional Buddhist wisdom story that tended to make them listen. And then I just say, well, we're going to do a short practice where you can just sit and listen and there's no right answer. Well, what do you mean there's no right answer? All my lessons are about having the right answer. So a lot of it depends on how you're sharing mindfulness and how are you defining it and what do you want the outcome to be.
yeah.
um mhm.
Also, I think obviously you said that you obviously grew up in a household where your father was sort of role modeling a lot of that this type of thing, and it may not have a measurable effect on pupils in the short term. I wonder, how many of those pupils will you plant a seed with some of those things that you do with them, and then they come back to it later on in their life. Mhm.
You've said it exactly. It's planting a seed, you know, and even if, I mean, I've taught groups of, GCSE students who were not interested. No, they did not want to sit there and be quiet. Um, it's the younger kids and the older kids I found that tend to be more interested. That mid-range, they don't want to do anything.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but still planting the seed.
Yeah.
And often it is stories that kind of spike our interest. It's a story sometimes rather than a practice that will stick with someone.
Mm.
But as you say, planting the seed is important anyway. Whether or not they enjoy the session, it's planting that seed.
Mm.
Yeah.
Just to go back to that research, I was part of it initially. It was called the Myriad Project in
That's it.
Oxford Mindfulness Center. 11 million from the Wellcome Trust to research the effects of mindfulness in schools. But what it was is I didn't continue because there were no schools in Wales, and that's where I was based. Um, but I did the training. But they were training teachers in person or online, and they were as what they were researching is whether the teachers taught online or the teachers taught in person were better teachers in the school. Um, and I've since then I've been teaching teachers online as well. But it's that case of do they practice, or is it just teaching the intellectual aspect of it? And there's no way to measure that really, is there? Um, And so I think that the research was flawed in some extent. Not to say that it doesn't work in schools, because I don't think it does work in schools in some cases. The curricula that we have, because they're the curricula designed for the time before the iPhone was invented, and there's a different ball game entirely now. I think we have different brains. Um, but I can't count on two hands the amount of times a student has come to me and said, "Oh, that thing we did, that 7-Eleven breathing or whatever, I've really used that because, I've been in really stressful situations." So it just provides this toolkit of techniques that can be called upon whenever some kind of mental health emergency arrives, so, and the research couldn't really measure that. So I would qualify that it showed that mindfulness didn't work in schools. It
Yeah.
doesn't in some senses, but some of it, like you said, plants seeds um, and such. So yeah.
It's also, I think you're right, and it's if it's being taught, because of course it's been completely secularized mindfulness. That's why we have it in our culture because it's past the gatekeepers of science and which is great. And I love the science behind it, and it's important that it is based in that it's evidence based. Um, but I also think that's a downfall when it just becomes a sort of method or maybe a philosophy, because then there's no real investment in it, maybe to do it. Whereas from a Dharma perspective, you don't know if this is your last breath. And are you happy? Do you want to be happy? Well, quit messing about and start practicing. Start becoming more of who you are and stop getting tangled up in everything you're not. That's motivating. Like, yeah, I want to live my most open-hearted life. I want to know myself as life. But you can't, the secular approach is too limited for that perspective, which is why I think some of the stories that you can tell in schools, because they're just stories, but they sort of have that implicit big picture within them that is quite stirring sometimes.
That's fantastic. Is there a curriculum for children coming, Mike, that we can?
Well, I've got two kids and maybe, I'd like to spend a bit more time on thinking about how to convey this more effectively to children of all ages. Um, you know, um, yeah,
I think Paul and Alice would agree with me that it's an urgent matter.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually have a little section in my timetable next year that's nobody really knows what to do with it. And I was thinking, oh, maybe I could just, but they're 14 and 15, and now I hearing you talk, I'm like, maybe that, just once a week just wouldn't be enough. But on that note, what story would you say would be the best story to start off?
Wow. I mean, there's so many, and they don't have to be, um, stories from the mindfulness tradition. I would start with uh, world wisdom stories, of which, just pick up any book by Joseph Campbell, who was a very famous mythologist, studied all the world's religions and spiritual traditions. And so you've got Greek myths, you've got the Egyptian myths, you've got the Buddhist stories, you've got the Zen stories the Zen stories that you oh, um, Native American stories. In fact, I don't know if you're familiar with the TV show Bluey, the Australian cartoon Bluey, because we've got kids, so they watch Bluey. But I don't know if you've seen it, and sometimes I think I'm just seeing things that I want to be there. But I'm pretty sure the writers or the writer is fairly influenced by, Buddhist tradition and the non-dual traditions, because this is a cartoon for young children, 5, 6, 7-year-olds. Um, there's a handful of episodes in which there's a Buddhist parable, but done in a sort of modern context. Uh, and I'm sort of walking through the room and I have to stop and watch it and say, this is a Buddhist story. And then there was one where they were doing sock puppets. And in the show, the puppet realized that there was no one inside him, it was just a hand. Anyway, it got quite non-dual. And but those are stories and they are just going in to kids. There's no criticism. Oh, hang on a second. No, it's just being absorbed. I think stories are great for that, which is why the wisdom traditions have stories. They're not just going around saying, stop thinking, there's no
Mm,
self. People would just react to that argumentatively. Well, you tell a story. So what I would suggest, I've said this to someone else that works in one of our local secondary schools, who also wants to teach, or he does teach mindfulness, but I also said, learn or choose some stories that resonate with you and just share them and then say to the class, what was that about? What did that story mean? And then you have a discussion about wisdom. And you're not saying, like, be quiet, focus on your breath. No one wants to do that. You know, but a story, it does a lot more than the story itself. So that's,
yeah, thank you. I just had one more. You said you had you'd read one sentence in a book, and that was the moment when your mind blew. Do you remember what that sentence was, or the
yeah,
book?
yes,
Yeah.
I do. So the book it's called The Transparency of Things, and it's by Rupert Spira or Spira.
Well, I'll make a note. Yeah.
And the sentence was, so I was reading the book and he was talking about how the ink that forms the words was not separate from the page it was written on. So there was no page and the words. There was the page and the words were on the page. It's one thing. Words and page was one thing, not two things. And then he said, in exactly the same way, your awareness is appearing right now as everything you are experiencing around you. So suddenly the idea that all of this was out there and I was somehow in here somewhere, detached from it, just popped. And there was just this non-dual. There was no me in here, there was no out there. It was, I mean, it's hard to describe, but it was like everything was me, but I was nothing. So it was both like Mike disappeared, but there was this sort of huge expansion into being everything. And that was the very thing I'd been searching for. Um, and it was so simple and obvious. It wasn't a mystical experience. It wasn't some sort of altered state of consciousness. I wasn't meditating. I wasn't following my breath. There was no mantra. It was like, oh, this is what I am. And it was so simple. Because it is that simple. And when you read the awakening moments of previous teachers and masters, there's always that moment where they realize, oh, it's just this right now. How could I miss this? I was reading books about this.
Yeah, thank you. And just one last thing, do you have a word for God now? An alternative word for God?
Uh, as someone that grew up in Buddhism where they have no God, there are gods, but there's not the God. I never liked the word God because, I wasn't Christian or anything. But soon after the awakening, that was one word that just made sense. And it wasn't God as in some sort of higher being doing things or controlling things. It was just the sort of God as everything. And so in that sense, I still quite like that word. But you could call it consciousness or awareness. But as I said earlier, I prefer just not to call it anything or call it what you want, but it's none of those things. So,
Thank you.
thank you.
Yeah, there's a book, Consciousness is All by Peter Zubin.
Ah, yeah,
So I had a similar experience reading a sentence in that, which also referred to the book, which is interesting, isn't it?
that's
In
interesting.
front of you. But I've read it again and I can't find the sentence. I don't know what it was. But it was the same bang, it was just destroyed. Um,
Hmm.
yeah. One strange question I have coming up is, what's it like to teach on a small island? How does that change how you teach? Or
Well, well, it's a small pond, There's only so many fish in it.
hmm,
So I've taught a lot of people over the 12 years or so of teachings, which is great because it does develop a community.
hmm,
Like if I was living in London or something, or Bristol, I used to live in Bristol, there's so much going on that it just gets washed into everything else. But when I came back to the island, one of the reasons I started teaching mindfulness, as I term it, was because there was just nothing like that here. There was nothing as direct and practical. There was lots of sort of spiritual things, but I mean, I don't know how it sounds, but I always try to avoid spiritual people because it always just seems so wishy-washy, and there were a lot of beliefs that were, unexamined beliefs happening, and it's blended with a sort of hedonism, and it just didn't really seem like there was any structure or people. You meet them 10 years later and they're still, floating around in a caftan. You're like, well, have you not enlightened yet? So
hmm,
here it's a bit different because through the teaching and the practice, I know many, many people. I know people interested in developing and practicing mindfulness, but I also know a lot of people that have had glimpses or even awakenings from the non-dual side of things,
hmm,
which I think is pretty good for a small island.
hmm, hmm,
Um, so it's nice, but I just can't walk through the town centre anymore
hmm,
because with my family, it's just like, Dad. because people, "Hey, Mike, hey Mike," and I'm stood there talking to them for 10 minutes. So
Mm. It just brings to mind one of my first teachers was Krishnamurti and Jiddu Krishnamurti, and he would say that it just needs 5 people to change and the whole world changes. So I wondered if it had a more impact in the sense that it is a small population with this critical mass, of people. Um,
I'd like to think so.
hmm,
As I say, I know people certainly I have a weekly Zoom group, which is maybe 20 people or something, a bit less than that.
hmm,
But certainly there, people have had definite glimpses and definite shifts in the way they perceive themselves over time. Um, so yeah, I think, and I mean, I love Krishnamurti as well. But I think he's right. It's you share this with someone and they get it, and that ripple effect just continues then.
hmm, hmm. So
Hmm.
I've just got one last question, unless anybody else has one. So, Mike, you have your 6, 7-year-old self in front of you that thinks that you're here to become enlightened. What do you want to say to him?
Oh, what a question. I don't know if I would say anything because if I said, "Oh, don't worry, don't do anything. It's fine. You are already, you know, consciousness. There's nothing to do," I wouldn't have done anything.
Mm,
Um, for me, everything unfolds exactly as it unfolds. So I'm not one of those people who think, well, if I could go back in time to when I was 20, I'd say, don't go there, go here. Or don't do that, do this. It just works out the way it works out. And so, it'd be a joy just to hang around that 7-year-old for a day or two, just to watch him being 7. But other than that, I think I would just stay quiet.
mm, lovely. Thank you so much.
Thank
And I
you.
hope we can ask you to join again in this video channel and drop in and podcast because we do want return visitors uh, as we grow as a community of practice as well.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for your questions and for listening. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for
Thank you so
allowing me to share with you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Okay.
much.
Thanks you.
Bye-bye.